Our sermon on May the 3rd, 2020 took a rather different form from usual. It being Shepherd Sunday, including readings from Psalm 23, the Lord's my shepherd, and Jesus talking about being the gate of the sheep pen in John 10, I thought I'd ask Kingshill Baptist Church members Pete and Jan about their experience as, in their own words, pretend shepherds, part of a local lambing cooperative. I began by asking them what their role entailed. What kind of things did they have to make sure were provided for their sheep?
So that's food and water and shelter. Safety. So that's about whacking in fence posts and putting up fencing and things, that's something that our little cooperative quite enjoy. When lambing comes around, everything is a bit different. We tend to offer them more support, so they go into the barn around lambing time, so that the lambs are not vulnerable to foxes as newborns, which they would be in the field, and keep this warmer and drier in the barn at night.
I think one of our major roles is to make sure that throughout their whole lives they lead a stress-free life as we can possibly make it.
Yeah. So we have to look at them every day to make sure they're all right, they're all there, they're not tangled up in some stock fence, but they all look well. What else?
Would you? So you said that there's thanks. That's really helpful. When you look at the sheep, you said that actually you're part of a cooperative. How many people in your cooperative of shepherds?
Well, it varies depending on what we're doing, because we all have very different skills in a cooperative, and some people are better at doing spreadsheets and rotas than delivering lambs. So it varies between about 4 of us are the key, really, and then there are other people who are more loosely connected with us.
And in terms, so between the 4 of you who are most kind of heavily involved in that, would you say that what proportion of a day, and let's say it's lambing season, what proportion of a day are you there engaged directly in the care of the lamb, of the sheep?
Well, during lambing it's all day, and because you are not in control of what's going on in the barn, and so we're on a 24-hour rota, and we check them every 4 hours. And obviously if something's happening when you're there, you'd call in somebody, normally Pete. So it's sort of fairly overwhelming during lambing season, but the rest of the time it's much less onerous.
That's brilliant, thank you. Interesting reflections there on always being, a shepherd always being present, and yet there being times when the need for your presence is greater than others. So how do the sheep respond to you as a shepherd? What kind of natures do they have, and how do they respond to you?
Well, we have 9 breeding ewes, and each one of them has got a different character. And some of them, number 1, for example, she's very, very friendly, and she will always come and nuzzle up to you and wants to have a bit of a chat. There's others like number 6, who we call Elvis because of her big sideburns. She's very standoffish, and no matter what you do, no matter how much you try and bribe her or be friends with her, she will not have anything to do with you, except that when any of them are in difficulty, they will completely accept your help. Even number 6 had a very difficult labour this year, and she sort of has a complete change of character when she is in need, thank goodness, and is happy to accept our help without being so sniffy.
Great. Do you find that they're, the characteristic of sheep is that they're stupid and stubborn? Is that true?
No. I mean, depending on their personalities, they'll seem like stupid and stubborn. I think that's partly in the eye of the beholder, I think.
I think normally that's when we're trying to get them to do something that perhaps they don't see the point of.
Wow, and again, a powerful effect. What to think about the fact that actually, how often are we, how often might God will and want us to do something, and we don't want to do it because we can't see the value in it.
Yeah.
Mm.
And certainly there's no way to shift a pregnant ewe who doesn't want to be shifted, apart from bribery, which we're very good at. But that, physically, you just cannot shift her if she's dug her heels in.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah. We were trying to get a ewe that was about to deliver a lamb out of the field and into the barn where she could be sort of more cozily enclosed. But she wasn't having it, so we eventually ended up, and this is about like a 300-yard journey. So we eventually put 4 hurdles around her and just sort of leapfrogged the hurdles all the way to the barn.
It's not like they show in Countryfile, I tell you.
Right. And you don't have any sheepdogs either.
No,
No.
We are the sheepdogs.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, my next question was going to be: is there a way to get them to respond differently? I think you've outlined a little bit of that already, but what you've talked about some ways. What do you bribe them with?
Food. Can't beat a food bucket. Even if they see you walking through the field, they'll ignore you unless you're carrying a bucket. It may be an empty bucket, but if it's a bucket, then it's food. And they hear us fill the bucket in the barn about 200 yards away. They'll hear the sound of the feed going into the bucket, and they get all very excited and rush over to the feed trough. So yeah, they're very food enthusiastic.
That's great. That's good. And anything else you ever get them to do what you want?
Well, they do get used to repetition. So when we put them away in the barn for the first few nights, it's all a bit chaotic, but they very quickly learn the routine. So it's quite useful to keep to a routine, and then it all goes like clockwork once they've learned it.
And they'll also follow a lamb. So sometimes if we have been unable to move the mum who's just had the lamb into the barn before she's had the lamb, once the lamb arrives, and particularly with twins, you can move the first lamb into the barn and she'll follow and have the second one in the barn. But they'll follow a lamb when you pick up the newborn lamb and carry it, they'll follow it. Unless you lift it up too high, and then they lose it. If you lift it more than like 3 feet high, then they can't find it. That's a bit weird. So it's back-breaking work carrying this newborn lamb across a field. They're like 2 foot off the ground.
That's great. Okay. So so an interesting thing about needing to keep things in our vision, and actually that when stuff goes out of our vision, it's difficult for us to see, to understand where we're being led. I always think that picture of God lighting our way along a difficult path to walk 1 footstep at a time, only ever as far as 1 footstep, actually can sometimes be a helpful and comforting thought, can't it? So 2 other quick questions. I wondered, what extent do the sheep have to ever kind of shepherd one another? Do they ever look out for one another? Do they need you to do all the basic stuff, or yeah?
Well, that's quite an interesting one, because I think that the slight conception that most people have is that the flock work together very much, and certainly in our experience, when everything is going well, they don't. They just do their own thing. Obviously, the mums look after their babies, but the ewes work completely independently, and you'll often find them spread all over the place. But it's interesting that when there's a common enemy, for example, when a fox enters the field, immediately all the ewes will gather together and get the lambs in the middle of them and protect them, and they'll actually face up to a fox or a dog, and they normally would never do that. They'd normally run away. So when there's a common enemy, they all draw together, but generally not.
Fantastic. That's really helpful, thank you. And just a kind of thing, what brings you joy and what brings you sorrow in this role?
Well, I thought I'm going for sorrow so that we can end up on a joyful note.
Okay, great.
But the sorrow that we have is when one of the lambs or one of the sheep is suffering something. It's in particular when we feel that it's something that we could have helped avoid. For example, it's very easy to miss the first signs of fly strike, which is a terrible thing, where the flies lay their eggs in the wool and the maggots eat the flesh of the sheep. And it's very easy to miss the first signs of that. And when you have done that, you feel so responsible for that sheep's misery. That is the most sorrowful thing, I think, that we know. And it's obviously, it's very sad to lose a lamb, but it's not the same as when you feel that it's your responsibility.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Pete.
The joys. The lambs are the biggest joy, I think. When they're born, I mean, it's the miracle of life thing. You know, they come out and they often look as though they'll never survive. They just lie there still, sometimes for like up to a minute. They're not really doing anything. And you think, oh crikey, it's dead, and then it somehow gets itself started, and then over the course of the next hour, it'll gradually stand up, and you see this little thing wobbling around on the floor and falling over a few times, and it's so cute. And then about 2 weeks later, there's a whole posse of lambs rushing around the field in a little group, doing that sort of funny pogoing they do, where all four legs come off the ground. Very joyful. What else? Yeah. And the only other thing is that we got the satisfaction of knowing where the food comes from. So that's good for us.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very, very much. Thanks very much. How many lambs have you got at the moment? Your lambing season is finished now, isn't it?
We're 15 lambs.
Fantastic. Well, and happy ewes.
Yeah, all very happy at the
moment. All is well.
Good. Glad to hear it. Pete, Jan, thanks very much for sharing that insight with us. I really appreciate you taking the time out to kind of chat. And I hope people have found some kind of interesting and useful reflections there on kind of what it might mean to be a sheep or a shepherd. I suppose if I was going to add anything, it would just be to say that, you know, you all know Psalm 23 and how well it features even in popular culture, as wide as songs from Kanye West, Megadeth, U2, Pink Floyd, from films like Titanic, The Wicker Man, X-Men 2. Psalm 23 is in all of those things somewhere along the way, and so it's kind of ubiquitous. But I hope from what Pete and Jan have said, I wonder if we can reflect on the fact that Jesus as a shepherd might mean somebody who cares, protects, is looking out for us, and at times really, you know, that sense that actually, Pete and Jan talking about actually during lambing, it's a 24/7 thing. I mean, I'd like to think that God's looking out for us 24/7. So there's that sense of a protector, someone feeding us, helping us along the right path. And although you might think of your vicar or minister or pastor or me or whoever as a shepherd of the flock you're part of, I think there's a thought that I keep coming back to, that there's a certain extent that even if the sheep themselves don't do this, apart from when faced with a common threat, there's an extent to which we all shepherd one another. We all are responsible for looking out for one another. In the other reading for today, we haven't heard it, I haven't read it today, I haven't had it as a reading today, but in the gospel reading, Jesus refers to himself not just as a shepherd, but as the gate. He protects and looks after the sheep. He safeguards them, keeps out those who would seek to separate people from the care of the shepherd. Sometimes that picture can be used very badly to set up boundaries around who might be acceptable in a life of faith. But what a way there can be to think of the role not of Jesus but of each of us, not to stop people from getting to God, putting fences and gates around it, but from saying actually we have a responsibility to call out that behavior in others so that people are not separated or distanced from the love of the shepherd. But actually we are called to call out and challenge those people who seek to put limits on God's love, who say that love is only for certain people. I hope that going forward today and this week, you might continue to find ways to be a shepherd for somebody else, to pastor somebody else, to give them a call and just check up. Maybe you're a sheep who needs some particular care at the moment, actually. And I hope that there's a shepherd who's looking out for you, whether that's me or somebody else in your community or one of you. So I hope that some of those reflections have been helpful today.